general, I recognized how important it is for all of us to be involved. And as far as my involvement with Farm Bureau, it boiled down to one simple phone call. Lene and I were at home one night and the phone rings. This was 25 years ago. Lene answers it and she starts laughing and she goes, "I think you mean my husband." And she turns to me and she says, "There's a guy on the phone that wants to talk to my father." And on the phone was a Farm Bureau member and a farmer from the Butterfield area, and now a dear, dear friend of mine, Mr. Kurt Blumgren. And Kurt reached out to me, and not only did he talk me into running for the pork producers and get involved there, but he asked me to become a member of Farm Bureau. And like I said, this was 25 or 26 years ago, and I didn't know much about Farm Bureau. And so I asked him if they had a policy book that I could read up on, because I do really enjoy reading. And so he took the initiative to deliver a policy book to me, and then I took the initiative to read it. And once I finished, you know what, I agree with these policies and what it is that they stand for. So then I called Kurt back and I said, "Sign me up, Kurt." I said, "I'll become a member." Well, then his next question was, "Would you run or participate in the Young Farmer and Rancher discussion meet?" And I had absolutely no idea what that is or was either. And so he informed me on what that was. And so I decided to participate. Well, the first time I ran, I got creamed. And, you know, it's one of those things, you go back home, you dust off, and come back more informed and ready to go. And it was just a wonderful process. The second year that I ran, I made it to the Final Four and I won. And, you know, Mr. President, you talked about the competition. I had, of course, in the Final Four, 3 of the competitors, 2 of them were absolutely phenomenal. They were very smart, articulate, well-spoken, right? The third one was Mr. Peter Bakken. And so, you know, and if Pete and I, if we didn't give each other some public, you know, grief, you would think we were sick. So I want to just do a shout out to my friend, Mr. Bakken as well. But what a wonderful opportunity to participate. And not only did the training go a long way, but just the encouragement and support that I had from Farm Bureau members. And I want to share with the viewers the importance of being involved. And I'm going back to that Final Four. After participating in that, I had the honor to represent Farm Bureau at both the St. Paul Capitol and fly out to Washington, D.C. Now, when I was out in Washington, D.C., I'm a very, very passionate person. Those of you that know me probably know and understand that. And I learned a valuable lesson. And I think that my first meeting out in D.C. as a Farm Bureau member is used today as training. And it may be a training as far as what not to do. And let me explain. When I was welcomed into, I believe it was the first congressional office that we went into. And again, I'm very passionate. We walk in there with about 6 other people, and I was very nervous, right? And I remembered what I was supposed to be saying and the whole piece. But as we were meeting, the congressman couldn't meet with us, but as his staff member was meeting with us, I felt like we were being completely disrespected, and I was getting madder and madder and madder. And when it was my turn, I did my spiel, and the person that was working for the congressman basically treated me with contempt as well. That's my take on that. And turned to ask the next person to speak. I said, "Wait a minute." I said, "We traveled thousands of miles to come out here to lobby on behalf or advocate on behalf of agriculture, and we expect to be heard." And he said, "You were next." And I said, "Wait a minute. If I was heard, repeat what I said." And he looks at me and he goes, "Well, you said," and his eyes started watering, his lips started quivering. He had no clue. He says, "This isn't a 3rd grade quiz." I said, "That's good. It's not a 3rd grade question." And then he threw me out of the office. And I said, "You're not going to throw everybody out on my behalf. If you think I was disrespectful, I will excuse myself. But you better take the time to listen to the people who are very passionate, have taken their time, their busy time, to travel out here to talk to their representatives on issues that are very important to them." And I left. Well, that was a valuable lesson for me as a legislator. And the reason I bring that up is because the legislature is made up of, it's a citizen legislature. And so you have, whether it's a pork producer, you have teachers, police officers, business owners, lawyers. Not everybody is an expert on the issues that are important to you. And so you must take the time to travel to St. Paul and lobby or advocate on behalf of issues that are important to you, because someone's going to tell your story. And if it's not you, then who? And somebody will tell it. And if not you, you're probably not going to like what it is that they're telling or sharing with legislators. Now, going back to being kicked out of an office, when people come into the office in which I occupy, it's not my office, it's the people's office. When people come into the office that I occupy, I will treat you with respect. I will listen closely, I will take notes, I'll ask for any information that you may have, and if you provide it to me as a legislator, I will read it. And the other thing that I do is I will follow up as far as doing additional research on the subject, because I understand that there's two sides to every issue, at least two sides. And I tell you, the wonderful staff that I work with, they too will treat you with respect and listen closely and carefully if I'm not able to meet with you, and they do. Because again, you are taking the time out of your busy day to come up and advocate on things that are very, very important to you. And so it was a valuable lesson, I believe, for both me and the individual that I talked to, because that person that threw me out of his office, he's still working in DC. I have talked to him in the past, and I talked to the people that he works with, and we laugh about it today. But it was a very, very valuable lesson. So again, it's very important that all of you stay involved, because again, you're the experts in all this. So with that, I see that Mr. President, is there something that you would like to say? Otherwise, I can go in on the topic at hand too.
Well, thank you, Representative Hamilton. We've got about 6 or 7 minutes. I know there's a question or two already in the queue, but maybe just a quick update, and then we go to questions, if that's okay with you.
Well, absolutely. So a quick update on the legislative process. Right now, the governor continues to call us back every 30 minutes, or excuse me, 30 days. So that the governor, seems like 30 minutes, but every 30 days. But the governor needs to extend his emergency powers. And there's some controversy around that. There's some lawsuits that have been filed. Whether or not, he's abusing his powers. There's some lawsuits around mask mandates and stuff like that too. But there's two critical issues that I believe we still need to negotiate and get passed. One is a capital investment bill or a bonding bill. And the other one is some tax conformity, specifically Section 179, because that impacts us in agriculture severely. And so those are two topics that we must get addressed. But if I could give a shout out to the majority in the Minnesota House, it is absolutely critical that you work with the minority. You need our votes. And if you want our votes to pass a bonding bill, then you need to sit down with us and negotiate a bonding bill, and also with a tax bill as well. That's my one thing that I'm critical with the current leadership. Sit down with the minority. If you need our votes, you need to work with us and get our input as well. So with that, Mr. President, I know we also wanted to talk about climate change, I believe, but it's your time.
Yep, and we'll hear from Andrew Walmsley on that as well. I guess, Representative Hamilton, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is we do have a question for you. The bad news is it didn't come from Pete Bakken. So Amber, what's our first question? I will read that question if that's okay. Representative Hamilton, the recent budget forecast has the state deficit of 10%. Is that for the biennium or for the next budget cycle? Have you heard of any other details that you've heard about or willing to share with the callers today?
Yes, thank you for the question. Now, I'll take you back to the beginning of the year. The state was looking at $1 billion budget surplus before the whole COVID piece. Since then, it has been revamped to over a $2 billion budget deficit. Recently, the Minnesota Management and Budget came out and said we're looking at closer to a $4 billion budget deficit. And there are some indications or indicators that coming into the next biennium, that's just for this biennium, we're coming into the next biennium, so whoever is fortunate enough to win the election in November, they could be facing as high as a $10 billion budget deficit. I've had conversations with our lead on Ways and Means, asking Representative Garofalo what he thought as far as projections as well and what they're hearing. And he told me directly he's thinking anywhere to what he has heard from a $9 to $11 billion budget deficit. And I've heard from others that said that as well. That's just mind-boggling. And what I have said, and one of the things that I've been critical on the governor, because he talks a lot about the science, saying it's important, we have to focus on the science. And I said, but we can't lose fact of mathematics as well. We have to be addressing mathematics. And so again, we need to be addressing this at the legislature. The governor needs to take a serious, not only a serious look, but start taking steps immediately to address that deficit. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Our last question we've got is, what is the most important thing to remember when engaging with elected officials as a Farm Bureau member?
Yes, you know, remember it's a citizen legislature. And like I said in my opening comments, you have people all walks of life. And the vast majority of people that serve in the legislature are good people, regardless of what party they serve or in what body, the House or the Senate. They're really good people simply standing up for what they believe in. So remember that. So I would say be respectful, one, but also make sure that you're making those personal connections, because if I have an issue pertaining to, say, pharmacies, small rural pharmacies, I call Vern. He's my local pharmacist. He's my contact back home. So even though lobbyists and stuff like that are important, having that critical connection. So I would encourage all of your viewers here today, if you haven't already, get to know your senator and representative personally and reach out to them. And again, be respectful.
Thank you. We did have one sneak up, and I think we'll take the time to do this. We've only got a couple of minutes. The question is, there's bipartisan support for full Section 179 conformity, and Governor Walz has said he's in favor of it. So is there any chance it could pass on its own, or does it have to be attached to the bonding bill?
Absolutely, it'll pass on its own, and it should not be attached to the bonding bill. That's why it failed. The last, not this month's special session, but the previous special session, the majority in the House thought it would be, for whatever reason, well, because they want to get a bonding bill passed. They tied that, they played games with it and tied it to the bonding bill, and that's what killed Section 179. You have a standalone bill, it will pass. So if you are know any legislators who serve in the majority, call them and tell them to bring up a standalone bill. And if you could also, give encouragement to, other members as well, of course, because if they are standalone bills, they will pass. Section 179 will pass very easily. The bonding bill will pass if they would simply sit down and visit with the minority and put the projects in that are also important to the minority members. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Hamilton. We appreciate your time today. Appreciate all you do, not only for agriculture, but all rural Minnesota and quite frankly, all of Minnesota. So we sincerely appreciate your time and being able to join us today.
Appreciate the opportunity. And if I could, Mr. President, if I could just for a moment, I want to thank the staff of Farm Bureau. I understand that not everybody can leave their farm every single day to come to the Capitol. And I want your members to know that you are very well represented. With yourself, Mr. President, you do an exceptional job representing agriculture. You take a look at Amber and Josie, what the work that they do at the Capitol, you're very well represented. So I want to just give a shout out and say thank you to all the staff at Farm Bureau as well. With that, have a great day.
Thank you. We've got a great staff, and it's not just public policy, it's the whole team. We really appreciate that. Speaking of great staff, we've got another great Farm Bureau staffer. Up next, Andrew Walmsley. It's on the American Farm Bureau staff, and Andrew's been a champion for Farm Bureau and issues important to us in Minnesota and all 50 states in Puerto Rico. So with that, Mr. Walmsley, I'll let you do the appropriate introduction of yourself, any background you feel it's important for us to know, and tell us what a Farm Bureau member and others from Minnesota need to know about climate change. So welcome, and take it away, Andrew.
Well, President Pat, thank you very much for having me. I'd like to echo the piling on of what a great staff Minnesota Farm Bureau does have. I get to work with all 50 state farm bureaus in Puerto Rico, and it's always a pleasure to work with y'all and an honor to work with y'all. So I definitely appreciate that. And it's great to see many of your members. Some of them have texted me saying I might be ruining their lunch hour, so I apologize. But no, it's good to hear from y'all. We're going to dive in probably more on the policy side than the science on climate change, just to kind of give an idea of, as topics heat up around this subject, around sustainability, as we look towards the election, what is the outlook for farmers and ranchers? What does this all mean if a House and Senate ends up being Democratic along with the White House? What does it mean if President Trump stays in office in a Republican Senate? And kind of what are some of the private market opportunities that are out there? So unfortunately, I am going to put a couple slides up for y'all to view that'll hopefully make the case of what agriculture is doing. And a few of these, if you were at the annual meeting last year, you might have seen them. So I apologize for that, but there's a few that I've got some updated numbers that I wanted to share with you before we really got into the meat of some of the policy questions. If you recall, or for those of y'all that aren't aware, we launched a group last year called Farmers for Sustainable Future. Farm Bureau is one of the founding members. This was in response to the Green New Deal. That obviously reinvigorated a lot of discussion and questions around climate and around agriculture when it was introduced last year, the first session of Congress. This was an opportunity, though, for agriculture to come together, to have a discussion in DC that we probably haven't had in 10 years in regards to cap and trade and how ag is going to be treated when it comes down to climate policy. This is a producer organization run group. You can see many of the members on there. You might be members of some of these groups. But I wanted to make sure this group was a representative of farmers and ranchers. Because at the end of the day, you're going to be the last line of defense on whatever policy objectives that might come down the pike. But they're also going to be impacting you at the farm level. And so we have to make sure that if there is anything we support, that it works for farmers and ranchers. So we started putting together some of the numbers to say, what exactly is agriculture's footprint, at least in the climate side, and when you're talking about sustainability. And so we started utilizing our economics department, and Dr. Newton was able to pull a lot of these publicly available numbers. I think the big piece that should make us feel a little bit more comfortable talking about this subject and any subject when it comes to sustainability is we've got a pretty awesome record in agriculture. When you look roughly back over 2 generations or so, we've been able to produce almost 270% more while our inputs have remained relatively flat. So what that says is we're utilizing the same amount of resources, but getting 270% more out of that. That's pretty incredible. A lot of that's attributable to innovation, to all the technology we've adopted on our farms, improved genetics and seed and animals. And it's a great foundation to build upon. The other issue that you would hear a lot when it came to agriculture and greenhouse gases was that agriculture contributes over 25% of greenhouse gases. Well, that might be true worldwide when you look at all of agriculture across the world, but when you look at U.S. agriculture, we're still under 10%. I would argue a lot of that is due to the innovation you see in the other chart here, that we are so much less than the rest of the world, less than 10 compared to nearly 25%. And it's something that I'll show that we continue to improve upon. When you break that out a little bit further, just to give you an idea of what ag's contribution is compared to transportation, electricity generation, industry, and then commercial and residential. You know, ag's that little red sliver across there, that roughly 10%. But if you were to take into account all the different land use and how land is managed across this country, you know, forestry is not counted in the agriculture piece. When you look at this light green portion down at the bottom, agriculture would actually be a net sink if you were to take the numbers and calculate them a little bit differently. Unfortunately, that's not how EPA does that. But we have a huge opportunity to sequester more through land management, through our forest and the like. One of the big issues, and it was highlighted with Burger King and others, is with livestock agriculture. If we just stopped eating hamburgers, you know, that would solve all the problems in the world. But once again, when you look at U.S. agriculture and U.S. livestock emissions, it is less than 3% than all global emissions when it comes from animals. You know, beef cattle is just under 2%. Dairy cattle is under 1%, and swine is way lower there when you look at this chart. And has been fairly steady in that regard and has decreased over time. But the big important piece I want you to look at is the per unit of production. This goes back to producing more with less. So when you look back to roughly 1990, you see that the per unit of production for dairy is our biggest, we've seen our biggest gains there, our biggest efficiency gains with a 25% reduction in emissions per unit. We're close to 20% when it comes to swine, and then we're at an 8% reduction when it comes to beef cattle. So once again, that's showing we're producing more while using less. Just another way to look at this, if you go back to 1990 once again, it would take almost 100 million more acres to produce what we're producing today. So we are producing more once again with fewer acres. That provides opportunities for more conservation practices, and to make sure we're really taking care of those sensitive lands. But once again, it's that innovation in agriculture that we don't want to lose sight of whenever it comes to any policy. I mean, these are all very good trends in agriculture and something that we should be proud about. I mean, we've talked about livestock, we've talked about, you know, corn, cotton, beans, wheat. I mean, these are just some of the snapshots, but you see these trends all the way across the spectrum of agriculture. And it's not just what we're doing when we're producing food. When you look at the Minnesota Farm Bureau policy book, you look at the American Farm Policy book, you look at the things that we advocate for and support, you know, it has an impact as well. You know, Farm Bureau has been an all of the above energy supporter. We obviously see a lot of value in renewables, both on farm and off farm. Here's some trends just in the last 5 years or so. You know, we continue to see adoption of solar as those costs come down. You know, depending on if you have a wind resource in the country, we've seen widespread adoption of windmills. When it's feasible and the technology is right, you know, we see a pretty large adoption of methane digesters, and that's a platform that provides multitude of environmental benefits, from water to air to energy, to be able to use those type of technologies. But it's also been our strong support of biofuels. When you look in 2018 alone, those are the latest numbers that I have, we reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 71 million metric tons. That's the equivalent of taking 17 million cars off the road. So pretty impressive numbers, things that wouldn't be happening without the support of agriculture, and obviously a strong advocate that we have in Farm Bureau and our members. You know, one of the things we like to remind folks as we talk about any future climate legislation is that we kind of already have a bill, and that's the Farm Bill, that does a lot of the things that makes conservation possible, that incentivizes and helps us be better stewards. When you look at just the federal level, over 140 million acres is under some type of conservation or wildlife habitat effort. That's not talking private efforts, that's not talking state level, that's just federal. That's the equivalent to the states of New York and California combined. So nothing to sneeze at there. When we're looking at some of those practices that are being adopted on farm, things that I think a lot of folks are pointing towards the future on being able to sequester more carbon, things like cover crops, going to no-till, using conservation tillages, you see the uptick in all of those numbers. And once again, about a 5-year period, we've seen a 50% adoption rate when it comes to cover crops. almost 30% adoption when it comes to conservation tillage. So once again, those trends are definitely heading in the right way, and farmers are acting to the best they can to be the best stewards that they can. So going forward, where do things stand from a policy perspective? I threw this up here instead of maybe the Farm Bureau policy book because it's a little bit wordier, but it's some of the same themes. We want to make sure we incentivize innovation. Voluntary incentive-based is what's going to be key to moving the ball forward in this area. We've got to make sure we reduce barriers, and that's looking at all levels of government to look at where programs are working, where programs are not working, what improvements could be made. Is it more technical advice to producers? Is it utilizing more trusted partners in, say, your land-grant university and extension? What are the challenges that are out there? We've got to be based in science, and we've got to rely on that strong research that we look to in our land grants and through USDA to make sure we're actually implementing practices that work, that enhance sustainability. And when I say sustainability, in my mind, that's also profitability, because if you can't have economic viability going forward, you're not going to be that sustainable. You've got to look at resilient infrastructure. Whatever Mother Nature might throw to us, we've got to make sure we can get our crops from our fields to the markets around the world. So that's, from roads and bridges, our inland waterways, our ports, but it's also infrastructure like broadband to be able to implement some of the precision agricultural practices that will be needed to make us more efficient, make us more competitive on a world market, but also provide the environmental benefits that consumers are looking for. Broadband is going to be a key component of that, to be either to understand and digest the research, to utilize digital extension into the future, but also to implement the practices and being able to use the precision agriculture that we need. And then at the end of the day, we want to focus on outcomes, preferably market-based solutions. We don't want to just do something to say we did something. That doesn't serve any purpose. We want to make sure that we're making agriculture more resilient into the future, that we are providing societal benefits, and that at the end of the day, that we can improve the rural communities in which we live. And it must be local. A one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work in this country. I'm originally from Florida. We grow over 300 different commodities. There's a lot of challenges in doing that. Minnesota agriculture looks a lot different than Texas agriculture. And so recognizing that diversity also must be key going forward. So what are we looking at here? What are some of the potential policy outcomes, election outcomes? What are the challenges that are going to be presented going forward? Well, one of the first things I just want to highlight is some of y'all may have heard a little bit about back in June, President Duvall, Zippy Duvall, president of the American Farm Bureau, testified before the Senate Ag Committee. He was also joined by Land O'Lakes, National Farmers Union, and an EDF witness, a farmer from Indiana, Mr. Bible, to talk about the Growing Climate Solutions Act. This is a bipartisan bill that was introduced in the Senate and now the House. This is something that Farm Bureau, it meets our policy, and we thought it was important as we go through this process that we could be for something, because there's going to be some really bad policy ideas that we are going to have to be against. But this bill is all about providing information to producers. It would create a advisory committee at the U.S. Department of Agriculture to advise the secretary on these different emerging carbon markets. The panel would be made up of scientists, researchers, and farmers. Its directives is to develop kind of a gold star standard of common practices or common contracts or common items that the department deems important for farmers when it comes to these different climate markets. It's kind of the Wild West right now. I would say it's producer beware and participating in some of these. I think back to the early days of 2006, 2007, when there was a lot of, maybe an unfair characteristic, but snake oil salesmen out there when it came to renewables and biofuels. A lot of projects that got started and ultimately did not come to fruition, and a lot of farmers that were harmed. And so information is key and can be powerful, and that's really what this bill is about. It would direct the department to create a web platform that producers can go in and find more information. And then it can certify third-party entities, folks that are trying to aggregate credits or trying to sign up farmers, you could go in there and say, hey, do you kind of have the USDA seal of approval to meet these minimum standards that this advisory committee would create? And then it would be required to provide a report to Congress too on these issues. So this was something that is maybe a little different for Farm Bureau, that to hear us out there speaking positively about a climate bill, but at the end of the day, it's handing more information into the hands of producers to hopefully empower them to make good decisions, because there is a lot of uncertainty on where these markets might go. Few of these you might have heard of. Indigo and Nori are two groups right now that are signing up producers and signing them up to sell their carbon credits. I'm not endorsing these companies in any way. I would just say, once again, if you have access to an attorney, make sure they review anything that you sign when it comes to contracts. I won't go into depth on any of these, but happy to take questions maybe offline on what we do know on some of the work that's being done there. The other one is ESMC. This is Ecosystems Market Consortium. Farm Bureau, American Farm Bureau, is a member of this group. This is also a group full of private industry, a lot of corporations you would recognize, those in the ag space, but also on the food end like McDonald's and the like, that are trying to come together and create a carbon market, but also a water credit trading opportunity. A full slate of ecosystem services is their goal. And so they're working through that now, creating standards on what will hopefully be an opportunity to monetize many of the societal benefits that farmers and ranchers provide. Once again, a voluntary platform. It is not expected to go live until 2022. But if you look up ESMC, there's a lot of information on their website. You can see a lot of the players that are working there. But Nori and Indigo are two today that I'm aware of that you can sign up and start getting paid on carbon credits. Once again, it's still early. You might not be getting the best deal possible, but you could find some revenue through those opportunities. There are, of course, some mandatory markets. You look at California, you look at the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast. Not all of these recognize agricultural credits, but typically they will recognize a methane digester or methane gas destruction. And we're seeing projects built today because of those mandatory markets, providing an incentive and an investment there for producers to kind of capture some value. The other hot topic that is being kicked around is potentially a policy option. And we see this in the oil and gas sector, is basically a carbon destruction credit. So if you capture carbon, whether that's methane or the carbon dioxide equivalent is basically how it's treated, there's a value tied to that through a tax credit. So if you're a company that has tax liability and you invest in carbon capture or storage, the amount of tons that you destroy or capture, you get an equivalent carbon credit. It's varied over time. I think the value now might be around $45 a ton. There's some that see this value of adding agriculture into the mix to take advantage of that. As a farmer, there might not be, you might not always have tax liability, so the credit would have to be transferable. And that's kind of the design thought in this, is that when you did have tax liability, you'd use it for yourself, take that credit, and you'd knock off, $45 per ton off your tax bill, depending on how much carbon you're capturing or destroying. But if you could transfer that, there would be more buyers out in the market. And so that is one idea that's going to be kicked around. It's something that we're exploring at Farm Bureau. Some of our issue advisory committees are going to look into that on how does it work in the tax code and the impacts to agriculture. But that is a policy item that folks are talking about. The other is an idea of a carbon bank. This is something that Robert Bonney, who was in the previous administrations, now at Duke University, is a proponent of. This is utilizing the Commodity Credit Corporation to basically purchase carbon as a commodity. There would probably have to be some authorities deemed to USDA on this, but it would be treated like any other commodity. There's a couple ways this could be designed. It could be a buyer of last resort. It could kind of be a floor for a potential carbon market. But that is one idea that is floating out there, is to use the CCC and the authorities that the Secretary of Agriculture have to use as basically a carbon bank. Farm Bill. We obviously have gotten through mostly implementing the 2018 Farm Bill. If we were to see a potentially Democratic Senate in particular, and a Democratic House. I don't know how much the White House would matter, but it's a Democratic White House as well. You're going to see a pretty big change in potential foreign policy when we start working on the 2023 Farm Bill. I think there's a lot of expectation that more can be done in this space. How far, how radical we get, that is a question that will be obviously something Farm Bureau is very involved with. Do we go from some of the more traditional conservation programs in Title II to a heavy focus on climate practices? Is that a bad thing? Is it going to work for farmers? Those would be some of the questions that are out there. I think we'll see a shift, whether it is actually both chambers of Congress being democratically controlled. I could even see with a split Congress that there is a desire to address climate more through conservation programs. And there's probably some appropriate ways to do that. It's always devil's in the detail. Well, one of the big things you would hear a few years ago, and even quite frankly, up till a few months ago, was the idea of a carbon tax. This would put a price of carbon, or put a price on carbon with the idea that it increases over time and you basically push out fossil fuels. This is something that Farm Bureau is opposed to. This is something that would make it very difficult to farm, as you would increase our energy cost and our input prices. But there seems to be a shift as of late. If you look at the Democratic platform that was just released, carbon tax, and even Joe Biden's no longer, or actually I'm not sure if he had ever endorsed one, but is certainly not endorsing one. I think we're seeing a shift away from this idea, because it is so unpopular, to maybe potentially more deficit spending. I've had some conversations with some left-leaning groups that were pushing a carbon tax earlier, have now kind of backed away from that. They just are basically looking to see, if we don't do a carbon tax, how much money would it take to put into farmers' pockets for y'all to be quiet? I've literally had those kind of conversations. So I think in a way, that's a positive thing that we're not hearing much about a carbon tax. I'm concerned, as an organization that was traditionally concerned about deficit spending, that this will be a major push forward as we burden future generations with that debt. And I think they're going to try to throw potentially a lot of money around to adopt climate-friendly practices. On the surface, that might sound great. Depending on who's in power, you're still going to have a very strong regulatory apparatus to go after those industries or those practices that aren't in favor per se. So I think that is a very likely scenario if we see a Democratic administration, and particularly a Democratic House and Senate, is that you will see an increased spending in climate related practices and clean energy practices. A lot of that will be focused on the term they're using is distressed communities, or around environmental justice. So there will be a transfer of wealth in a lot of ways. But that is the goal. There will potentially be money spent on agriculture in this space to encourage producers to adopt climate-friendly practices. I think on that surface, that's fine, but I just worry about the regulatory hammer that might swing in behind that. And then my last point is I really don't think nothing's going to happen. I think we're a very different space than we were in 2010 with Waxman-Markey and the cap and trade bill. There's been so many public commitments by private companies to address sustainability and address climate that they're going to go forward in some way. And we're seeing that investment, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. There's kind of a two idea prong. If you're going to have a Biden administration and Democratic Congress, we need to create something that works for business and for industry. And that's where a lot of these conversations have gone. If not, if we see another 4 years of Trump or a Republican Congress, we've made so many public commitments, there's so many activist shareholders, and consumers are expecting it, that we must do something. And so there's still going to be opportunities out there for farmers to compete in these markets, hopefully. At the end of the day, we want to make sure that there are opportunities for farmers. We want to continue to build on all the points I made early on being strong stewards of the environment. But we need to make sure we do it in a way that doesn't hamstring agriculture, doesn't tie our hands. We much prefer a carrot than a stick, because at the end of the day, it's going to take American ingenuity. It's going to take entrepreneurship to continue to keep those trend lines going and the innovation needed to address the challenges into the future. So with that, President Papp, I will conclude, and happy to take any questions folks might have.
Well, I appreciate that, Andrew. And we do have some questions. Remind everybody, whether it's the Q&A box, raising your hand, the chat feature, or if you're on the phone, is *9. Our first question says, there seems to be a huge divide between urban and rural when it comes to climate change. How do we find common ground to work with our urban neighbors?
Yeah, unfortunately, there seems to be a lot of divide between our urban neighbors and you know, folks that are living out in the countryside. You know, the biggest way is building trust and communication. One of the things that we can't be terrified to take this subject on, and that was one of our hopes with Farmers for Sustainable Future, and trying to dig into the data that's out there to show folks that the agriculture is doing a pretty good job, and hopefully empower Farm Bureau members to feel a little bit more comfortable talking about this subject. But at the end of the day, data and numbers only go so far. It's building that human connection, that personal connection, that personal story with folks. And so I know it's not going to, we don't necessarily have the resources to do a huge campaign, but any opportunities we have to connect with our neighbors in the urban sphere, we need to take that. And I know there's a lot of different work being done with our communicators and our grassroots members, our women's committee, our young farmers. There's challenges in the age of COVID and virtually, but there's also opportunities. And so I think that's the only way we continue to try to chip away at that divide. Probably the other thing is getting off social media and turning off the television more than we do these days.
Next question has to do with, are there any words to use or words to lose when we're talking about climate change, global warming? Help us as Farm Bureau leaders to have that conversation. How is it best talked about?
Yeah, our comms team has done some of that research, and they knock me over the head sometimes because I'm not sure if I'm using all the correct terms. I don't think we should be scared to say the word climate change. I know it's something that a lot of our members aren't comfortable with, but the big challenge I see is we're talking past ourselves or each other in a lot of ways. We're wanting to figure out how we can be better stewards. That's a word I'm told we're not supposed to use, but I think it resonates in ag, right? We want to be good stewards of God's creation. That's not necessarily resonates with the consumer, but we're talking about the same things. They want to talk about climate change. They're worried because maybe they're not connected to the land, but I think it's an idea that they don't know what we're doing out on the farm. You know, I know folks are losing sleep at night figuring out, how do I pass it on to the next generation? How do I be a better farmer to make sure I'm using less resources, that I'm taking care of my soil and my water? And I think just expressing that in that way is one of the helpful ways without getting overly technical. We can get into science. We can talk about numbers. I think you've got to recognize the term climate change because that is kind of universally accepted in circles outside of ag. But then we can get into talk about what we really are trying to do on the farm, which benefits wildlife, which benefits water, which benefits climate, you know, all the things that consumers are worried about.
Next question, and maybe I'm going to ask Representative Hamilton to jump in on this as well. But as we look at trying to do something, if the federal government doesn't move fast enough or move at all, is it up to the individual state governments to do something? And will that create a patchwork of different regulations? So Andrew first, and then Rod, if you've got some comments as well, please.
Well, my political philosophy is the closest government is to the people, usually it's better. So I would say there is a role, but this is a role I think to incentivize and to make sure your state agriculture is as strong as it can be. You know, when it comes to the federal government, you know, once again, we're not looking for a broad regulatory framework or a tax to be put on agriculture because that's only going to harm us. But there is a role if it's decided, you know, through a farm bill and through that process that more investment wants to be made to get producers to produce in a certain way. You know, that is probably the most appropriate function there. But there's definitely a role for states to play. But I think you've got to do it in a way that doesn't impact interstate commerce and in a way that doesn't you know, hinder ag producers in that state.
Representative Hamilton?
Well, thank you. And I agree with what Andrew said. In addition to that, so let's recognize some of the things that the state has done. And this has been led by the ag groups. You go back just a few years, and I was very happy to carry the bill with the agreed language. That invested $17 million, additional dollars going to the University of Minnesota to focus on ag research. And those are the things that we have to do. It has to be farmer involved, farmer led, farmer driven, voluntary, and site specific. And as long as we stay engaged, telling our story, building those relationships with legislators, and then be engaged around the research around all of this, we can be directing where this needs to go versus having the legislator come down with a big hammer. So yes, we do all play a role in this, especially at state level, and we are doing some things because of some of the leadership here within this group. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Hamilton. Our next question comes from, oh gee, I'm not going to say who it comes from, but maybe you'll recognize his words. What advice would you give to the farmers as to how to pursue the whole carbon sequestration opportunities and how to know what's legitimate and what's not? I won't bring Pete Bakken's name up at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why we're out there supporting the Growing Climate Solutions Act, excuse me, is because we need more information. There's just so much uncertainty out there. And so I think there's some basic points to understand that we're probably early in any markets. So while there might be some money up front, you might be leaving money at the end of the day. The other thing is, make sure this works for your operation and for your family planning. You don't want to get tied into a long-term easement or something that doesn't work for future plans, but there's going to be some type of commitment there. You're going to have to prove that you've sequestered, that carbon, or you're destroying that carbon. At the end of the day, though, I'd make sure before you sign on to anything that you have an attorney look at it to make sure it's perfectly clear what you may or may not be surrendering in that contract. A lot of them call for a lot of data. Obviously, a huge issue in agriculture on who owns that. So I just would be cautious and do your homework. And that's something we're struggling to do because it is changing. We're trying to provide good information to folks. And I really think we're potentially on the tip of an iceberg on a lot of different opportunities where there could be kind of two tracks for farmers to choose from. Those that really want to go after there and get at it. You might want to participate in a private market and say, I can sequester more carbon than the next guy, and I might be able to get a higher price. The others that say, I just want to do the right thing, NRCS or my land grant, what are some practices I can implement? I'm not necessarily going to track and try to, up the numbers per se in carbon, but, help me be a better steward, what cost shares out there. So I think those are the two tracks we're going to potentially see in the future. It's just really early on.
Our last question is, if I'm in line at the grocery store or at the cafe or in the church basement and the conversation comes up with the words climate change and farmers, what's the most important message? The one thing we have to tell them?
Well, I think the one thing would be that we hear you and we wake up every day to do our best. And, number one is providing a safe, affordable product. But the second thing is that, here's a cool story on my farm on what I've tried to do to be a better steward. Or you use the number that, hey, in 2 generations, we're producing 270% more and we're not using any additional inputs, or, we're less than 10% of world greenhouse gases, and per unit, that's getting better every day. We don't have all the answers, but we certainly we hear you and we want to be a partner.
Thank you, Andrew. And we certainly thank you for your time today and all the time that you spend at the table for Farm Bureau. I'm talking about all kinds of issues important to agriculture and rural America. So thank you, Andrew. The last thing I want to do before I turn it over to Karen is again thank everybody that's in the room. I hope you can see everybody. This doesn't happen by itself. Putting this together, and I really appreciate that opportunity to have this discussion every Thursday. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Karen. Karen, please.
Thank you, President Papp. Working on some technical difficulties here. When we're all in the same room, we have these challenges. With that, I just want to thank Andrew again, and thank you, Representative Hamilton, for being a part of this. obviously Farm Bureau is very important. The most important thing to Farm Bureau is our members. And so if you are a member, thank you. If you are not a member, we would really love that you would consider joining. It's programs like this that we put together that are educational for our members. It's also all that policy work that's happening both in St. Paul, Washington, D.C., and in our local communities that is really important to ensure our future in agriculture. A little plug for some of the benefits of being members in addition to all of these wonderful policy initiatives. We have some great member benefits that we hope that you would consider checking out. And the biggest plug for member benefits is our insurance products. We have wonderful insurance products with agents all throughout the state. And if you have not explored Farm Bureau insurance, we encourage you to also reach out to an agent. They would love to visit with you about your needs and provide some quotes. Next week, we look forward to another great edition of Shop Talk. We're kind of coming down to the last couple here, but the next week's topic is very timely, talking about livestock markets and insights on that. And we will have American Farm Bureau's economist on talking about that. We saw some really interesting dynamics in that world during COVID, and honestly, for the last couple decades, there have been some interesting dynamics within livestock markets. So join us next week, and then we will have at least one more for us after that, and hopefully this will be a program we continue to look at offering. If you have any ideas for topics, please share them. But again, this is being recorded and can be found on our website or on our Facebook page. So thank you, everyone. I hope that you have a wonderful day, and we will see you next week.